The morning I returned from the city, the sun hung bright over Clear Lake, and everything looked exactly as I'd left it 2 weeks ago. The Hartwell building restoration had wrapped up on schedule. The cornices rebuilt to original specifications. My specialty work complete. Historic preservation always felt cleaner than real life. You follow blueprints, verified authenticity, and problems solve themselves through evidence. Real life, I was learning, didn't work that way. I pulled into the gravel driveway of Grandpa Walter's lake house just after 3 in the afternoon. The May warmth pressed against my shoulders as I grabbed my duffel from the trunk. The house itself was simple one-story wooden siding, painted that faded gray-green that happens when you're 50 yards from water and don't repaint every decade. Walter had built it himself in 1979, right after he retired from his carpentry business. I'd inherited it 6 months ago, after the funeral, and hadn't quite brought myself to change anything yet. The dock stretched 60 feet over the water, weathered planks ending at an old wooden post where Walter used to tie his rowboat. Except now there was a sign bolted to it, shiny aluminum, professionally printed, secured with 4 heavy-duty screws driven straight through the wood. The letters were bold and black, members only, HOA property. Below that, smaller text, Clear Lake HOA board. President Mrs. Vivian Carr. I stood there for a long moment, just staring. The aluminum caught the afternoon light like it was mocking me. Something hot flickered in my chest, but I pushed it down. Anger wouldn't help. I needed to understand what was happening first. Inside the house, I found a stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter. Most of it was junk grocery flyers, a property tax notice. Then, third from the bottom, I found a cream-colored letter on expensive stationery. Clear Lake Homeowners Association printed across the top in serif font. The letter was dated 3 weeks ago. I barely glanced at it before tossing it aside. Dear Mr. Grayson, it began in that formal, almost friendly tone that masked something uglier underneath. As part of our ongoing efforts to standardize and maintain lakefront common areas, the HOA Board requests your cooperation in adhering to updated access guidelines for shared waterfront property. Details regarding membership fees and dock usage will be distributed at our next quarterly meeting. Shared waterfront property. They actually believed the dock was communal. I looked out the window toward the lake. The sign caught the light, gleaming like a mirror. This wasn't a mistake. This was a territorial claim, and it had been made while I was gone, unable to object. I heard footsteps on gravel and saw Howard Brennan walking along the lakefront path. He was 70, lived 4 houses down, and had been here almost as long as Walter. I stepped outside and called his name. He looked up, saw me, and his expression shifted. Guilt, maybe, or embarrassment. He stopped walking and said I was back, like it was something he'd been dreading. I nodded toward the dock. Do you know anything about that sign? He glanced at the water, then back at me. His hands went into his pockets. Vivian pushed it through at the last board meeting. He said quietly. Said it was time to formalize lakefront access. Make it members only. Members only, I repeated, hearing the absurdity in my own voice. This dock has been here 45 years. Howard shrugged, but it wasn't casual. It was the shrug of someone who'd lost an argument and was tired of carrying the weight of it. She's got the board convinced it's for insurance purposes, he explained. Liability, upkeep, community standards. You know how it is. I didn't know how it was. I'd inherited this place 6 months ago and hadn't paid much attention to the HOA beyond signing the annual dues check. Walter had always kept to himself, never went to meetings, never caused trouble. She can't just put a sign on my property, I said. Howard's face tightened. That's the thing, Ethan. She's saying it's not your property. The dock, I mean. She pulled some old survey maps claiming the waterfront belongs to the community. Says it was part of the original covenant when the HOA formed in 2000. Something cold settled in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just the slow, precise awareness that this was going to be more complicated than ripping down a sign. I asked Howard if my grandfather had ever contested Vivian's claim about the waterfront. Walter didn't go to meetings, Howard said, shaking his head. Didn't argue. I think he figured if he kept quiet, they'd leave him alone. He paused, shifting his weight like the conversation was physically exhausting him. Vivian's been president for 8 years. She doesn't like quiet. What do you mean? She runs this place like a corporation, he said. Last year, she fined the Parkers $200 for painting their mailbox the wrong shade of blue. They moved 3 months later. 2 decades in this neighborhood, and a mailbox color drove them out. I processed that. A woman who fined people over mailbox colors had just declared my family's dock communal property. Did anyone vote against this? I asked. Howard's silence was answer enough. Finally, he said, I told her it wasn't right. But she said, if you had a problem, you could take it up at the next meeting. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. The way someone looks when they've watched something wrong happen and didn't have the courage to stop it. My advice? Don't fight her. She's got resources, allow her on retainer, the whole board behind her. He walked away, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying something heavy. I turned back to the house. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the yard. Inside, I went to Walter's small office. His desk was still covered with his things. A coffee mug with dried residue at the bottom. A stack of woodworking magazines, and on the corner, a wooden box with a brass clasp. I'd seen it before but never opened it. His personal papers. Birth certificate, discharge papers from the Navy, the deed to the house. I sat down and opened it carefully. On top was an envelope with my name, written in his handwriting. Ethan. That was all. I pulled out the letter inside. The handwriting was his, but shakier than I remembered, the writing of an older man, but still precise. If they try again, this is for you, it began. The lake was here first. Before the neighborhood. Before the HOA. Before all of them. I bought this land in 1947, right after the war. 15 acres, including 400 meters of lakefront. I've got the paperwork to prove it. If anyone tells you differently, don't believe them. My pulse picked up. There's more in the basement. The letter continued. Behind the old wine rack. A door. The key's in this box. Use it if you need to. I looked back into the box and found a small brass key tucked under the deed. It was old, tarnished, with the numbers 1947 engraved on the head. I held it up to the light. Outside, the sun was setting over Clear Lake. The sign on my dock reflected orange and gold. I thought about Howard's advice. Don't fight her. But Walter hadn't told me to back down. He'd told me where to find the truth. I stood up, key in hand, and looked toward the basement door. The basement stairs creaked under my weight. The air smelled like old wood and concrete, that particular dampness that comes from being underground near a lake. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting yellow light across the space. Boxes of Christmas decorations. Old fishing gear. Tools Walter had probably forgotten he owned. And against the far wall, a wine rack made of dark wood, still holding a dozen dusty bottles. I walked over to it. The rack was heavy, built solid, like everything Walter made. I pulled on the edge. Nothing. I tried the other side. Still nothing. Then I remembered how he built things, never just one way to open them. I ran my hand along the underside of the top shelf and felt a small metal latch. I pressed a dot, something clicked. The entire rack swung forward on hidden hinges, smooth and quiet despite decades of disuse. Behind it was a door. Not a modern door. This was old wood, painted a faded blue, that had probably been bright once. There was a keyhole below a tarnished brass handle. I pulled the key from my pocket and slid it into the lock. It turned easily. The door opened inward and cooler air drifted out. I found a light switch on the wall inside and flipped it. A fluorescent tube flickered twice, then held. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. 3 walls were concrete. The fourth, the one I'd just come through, was the only wood. There was a wooden desk pushed against the left wall, a metal filing cabinet in the corner, and hanging on the back wall, a large map. I stepped inside. This wasn't a storage space. This was a workspace. Walter had built this intentionally, hidden it intentionally, left it for me to find. I walked to the map first. It was hand-drawn on what looked like professional surveyor's paper. The title across the top read Lake Survey 1947, Surveyor Logan Pierce. The lake itself was drawn in blue ink. Around it, property lines were marked in black. One section was shaded in red, a long strip covering the entire eastern shore. Acres of land stretching back toward what was now the neighborhood. In the corner of that red section, written in neat block letters, Walter Grayson Parcel, CL 470089, 15 acres. I traced the red line with my finger. It ran from a point north of my house, all the way down past where Howard Brennan's place sat now, then curved back inland. The modern neighborhood didn't exist on this map. There were no houses, no roads, just open land and lake. I turned to the desk. On it sat a leather journal, the kind with a strap that wrapped around to keep it closed. Next to it were 3 black and white photographs in plastic sleeves. I picked up the first one. It showed a young man, maybe 30, standing on an empty lake shore. He wore work pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Behind him, the lake stretched out flat and empty. No dock, no houses, just trees and water. I flipped it over. On the back in faded pencil, Walter Grayson, May 1947. First day. I opened the journal. The pages were yellowed, but the ink was still dark. Walter's handwriting, younger and sharper than the shaky script from his later years. The first entry was dated May 15th, 1940-7. Bought the land today. 15 acres for $1,200. The bank clerk asked why I wanted property this far out. I told him I wanted space, peace, somewhere I could fish and not hear traffic. He laughed, said there'd never be traffic out here. We'll see. I flipped through the pages. Entries about clearing brush, building the first cabin, logs about weather, about fish caught, about watching the seasons change. Then in October 1962, the tone shifted. They're building houses. A developer bought the land west of the lake. Says he's putting in 50 homes. I don't mind neighbors, but I hope they respect boundaries. My deed is clear. Registered with the county. The lakefront is mine. More entries followed. 1965. The neighborhood is full now. Families everywhere. Kids riding bikes. It's different, but not bad. They leave me alone. I leave them alone. Then 1979. Built a new house, bigger, better insulated. This is where I'll stay. 1999. They formed a homeowners association. Sent me a letter inviting me to join. I declined. Don't need someone else telling me how to paint my fence. The last entry was dated 6 months before he died. The handwriting was shakier now, but the words were still forceful. If you're reading this, Ethan, it means they tried again. They'll wait until I'm gone. They think you won't fight. Prove them wrong. Everything you need is in this room. The deed is in the filing cabinet. The survey maps are behind the ones on the wall. Don't let them rewrite history. I closed the journal and turned to the filing cabinet. A key was taped to the underside of the desk drawer. I unlocked it and pulled the top drawer open. Inside were folders labeled and organized with Walter's methodical precision. Original deed 1947. County registration 1948. Survey report Logan Pierce. 1947. Property tax records 1947 to 2024. I pulled out the deed folder and opened it. The document inside was on thick paper, slightly yellowed, but perfectly intact. It laid out everything in formal legal language: parcel number, coordinates, boundary descriptions, and 412 meters of waterfront access. I photographed every page. Then I pulled out my phone and opened the county assessor's website. I typed in the parcel ID. It took 3 seconds to load. The result came back. Parcel CL 470089. Owner of record Walter James Grayson, deceased. Transfer pending estate settlement. The property was still in his name because probate hadn't finalized yet, stuck in the bureaucratic gap between death and inheritance. My hands went cold. After 77 years, the parcel was still active in the county system, which meant every tax bill I'd paid, every piece of mail I'd received from the county, had been tied to this exact property boundary. I stood there in that hidden room, surrounded by Walter's carefully preserved evidence, and felt the full weight of what he'd left me. This wasn't just about protecting a doc. I spent the rest of that night photographing every document in the filing cabinet. The original deed, the survey report signed by Logan Pierce, tax records going back decades, each one listing the same parcel number, the same acreage, the same boundaries. I found a folder labeled correspondence and opened it. Inside were letters. One from 1963 from a developer asking if Walter would consider selling a portion of the lakefront for residential access. Walter's reply was polite but firm. The lakefront is not for sale. It will remain private property. Another letter from 2000 from the newly formed HOA inviting him to join and contribute to shared community resources. Walter had written declined across the top in red pen. Then I found something else. A letter from 2014 on HOA letterhead signed by Vivian Carr. It was addressed to Walter. The tone was different from the earlier invitations. It was formal, almost legal. Dear Mr. Grayson, it began. It has come to the attention of the Clear Lake HOA board that certain waterfront areas previously assumed to be community property may require boundary clarification. We request access to your property for a professional survey to establish clear lines of demarcation in accordance with county regulations. Please contact our office to schedule a convenient time. Below that, in Walter's handwriting, he'd written a single word. No. There was no other response. No letter sent back. Just that one word and then nothing. I photographed the letter and added it to my folder. The pattern was undeniable. The HOA had been pushing for years. First with invitations, then with requests, then with demands. And when Walter refused to cooperate, they'd waited. Waited for him to die. Waited for someone less informed to inherit. Someone who wouldn't know the history. Someone who might just accept their version of reality because it was easier than fighting. I looked back at the map on the wall. The red boundary line was precise. It ran along the entire eastern shore from coordinates marked at the north and to coordinates marked at the south. If those coordinates were accurate, then my property didn't just include my dock. It included Howard Brennan's shoreline. It included the stretch where the HOA was building their community dock. Thursday morning, I called a surveying company. Not just any company. I needed someone who understood historical land records. Someone who could take a 77-year-old map and verify it against modern GPS coordinates. I found Precision Land Survey Company online. Their website showed projects involving disputed easements, boundary corrections, and forensic land analysis. I called and explained the situation. A man answered, said his name was Landon Pierce. I can come out Thursday morning. he said. "Bring those original documents." When Landon arrived with his assistants and equipment, he spent a long time studying the map from the basement. He ran his finger along the boundary lines, checking the coordinates written in the margins. Then he looked up at me and said this was a federal survey, the kind done by government surveyors after the war. If the markers were still in place, this map was as good as law. We walked the property line. He started at the north end where the coordinates indicated the first boundary marker should be. It took 20 minutes of searching through overgrown brush before one of his assistants called out. There, half buried under decades of leaf litter and soil, was a concrete marker. Old, weathered, but intact. The top was flat and smooth. Carved into the surface were numbers. CL470089. Landon crouched down and brushed the dirt away. He set up the GPS unit directly over the marker and took readings. Then he pulled out a tablet and compared the numbers to the coordinates on Walter's map. He looked at me and said it was a perfect match down to the centimeter. We moved south, following the boundary line. Landon explained that in 1947, surveyors used physical markers, usually concrete or stone, placed at key points along property lines. If we could find even 2 or 3, he could verify the entire boundary using triangulation and GPS overlay. We found 3 markers. Each one confirmed the same line. By early afternoon, his overlay map told the complete story. The HOS assumed boundary sat 3 meters too far inland, just enough to steal every inch of waterfront. I asked how significant that was. He did some calculations on his tablet, measuring the length of the disputed strip and the width of the offset. Total area is approximately 3 meters wide and 400 meters long, he said. About 1,200 square meters. Not huge, but enough to matter. Enough to include every access point, every dock, every beach area the HOA claims as community property. He pulled up his computer showing the overlay comparison. The HOA's map versus his GPS survey. The difference was unmistakable. 3 meters along the entire eastern shore. He zoomed in on the area where the community dock was under construction. The concrete pilings they'd already poured sat 1 meter inside my boundary. The planned deck would extend another 4 meters. All of it on my land. I called a real estate attorney named Claudia Ree. Her office was small but organized, shelves lined with legal texts and case binders. I brought everything, the map, the photos of the markers, the deed, the journal. She listened while I explained the situation. Then she reviewed the documents. She spent a long time on the deed, cross-referencing it with the county's online records. Then she looked at the survey photos Landon had sent me. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "This is unusual, but not unprecedented," she said. "Boundary disputes based on historical surveys happen occasionally, especially in areas that developed quickly. The key is whether your documentation is stronger than theirs." "Is it?" I asked. "Absolutely," she said. "A recorded deed, physical markers, and a professional survey give you everything you need. The HOA's claim is based on assumption and tradition. Yours is based on law." She asked what I wanted. I told her I wanted them to stop claiming my property as theirs. I wanted the sign removed. I wanted acknowledgement that the dock and the shore it sat on belonged to me. She nodded. "We'll start with a cease and desist letter. Formal, legal, giving them 7 days to respond. If they refuse, we'll file for an injunction to stop any construction on the disputed land. And if it goes further, we'll sue for trespass and demand they remove any structures they built without permission." I asked how long it would take. "Depends on the response," she said. "If they're reasonable, maybe a few weeks. If they fight, maybe months." I told her to send the letter. Monday morning, Landon sent the full report. It arrived as a PDF 43 pages of the kind of technical precision that makes lawyers smile and opponents nervous. Inside were photographs of each marker, GPS coordinates down to the decimal point, overlay maps showing the legal boundary versus the HOA's assumed line, and a summary that used words like incontrovertible and legally binding. I read it twice, and I forwarded it to Claudia. She called me 30 minutes later. "This is exactly what we need," she said. "The report isn't just good, it's bulletproof." Tuesday, Claudia sent the cease and desist letter. The language was formal but clear. It stated that I was the legal owner of parcel CL470089, that the parcel included 412 meters of lakefront property, and that any structures or claims made by the HOA within that boundary constituted trespass, that it demanded removal of the members, only signed within 7 days, cessation of all construction on the community dock, and written acknowledgement that the disputed area was private property. It cited the deed, the survey, and the physical markers. Ended with a line Claudia had insisted on. "Failure to comply will result in legal action, including injunctive relief and damages." Wednesday morning, my phone rang. The caller ID said Vivian Carr. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Her voice was tight, controlled, the kind of calm that comes from practiced authority. "I received a letter from your attorney," she said. "I'd like to discuss it directly. Anything you need to say should go through my lawyer," I told her. "That's not necessary," she said. "We're neighbors. We can work this out like reasonable people." "Have you reviewed the survey report?" I asked. There was a pause. "The HOA has its own records," she said. "Records aren't the same as a legal survey," I said, and hung up. Thursday, I got an email from the HOA board. The message said the board had reviewed my claim and found it inconsistent with established community boundaries. It said the HOA had maintained the lakefront as common property since 2000 and that 24 years of continuous use constituted a legitimate claim. It said they were willing to meet to discuss a compromise, but they would not remove the sign or halt construction without a court order. I forwarded it to Claudia. She called me 10 minutes later. "The adverse possession argument is nonsense," she said. "Walter contested their claims multiple times. The letters in his files prove that. We should file for a temporary restraining order immediately." I agreed. Friday afternoon, we went to the county courthouse. Claudia filed the paperwork for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction. The judge reviewed the documents and scheduled a hearing for the following Wednesday. In the meantime, he granted the temporary order. As of 5 p.m. Friday, the HOA was legally prohibited from any construction within the disputed boundary. The clerk stamped the order and handed me a copy. Saturday morning, I drove to Vivian's house and served it to her personally. She looked at the document, then at me. "This is ridiculous," she said. "It's legal," I told her. She said I was wasting everyone's time over a property line dispute that could be settled with a conversation. I said we'd had a conversation. Now we'd let the court decide. By Sunday, the neighborhood knew. I'd received 3 text messages from people I barely knew. One asking if the community dock project was canceled. One from Howard saying, "Call me when you can." I called him that evening. He said Vivian had sent an email to the entire HOA mailing list explaining that a property dispute had temporarily delayed the dock project. She'd framed it as a minor administrative issue. Howard said people were talking. Some thought I was being unreasonable. Others were asking questions they'd never asked before. Questions about where the HOA's authority actually came from. Wednesday morning arrived cold and clear. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the county courthouse, but by 8:30, my phone was already lighting up with messages. Someone had posted about the hearing on the neighborhood group chat. By 9, there were 23 comments, most of them speculating about what would happen. A few calling me selfish. Others asking why the HOA had never mentioned the boundary issue before. I turned off notifications and drove to the courthouse. Claudia was already there, standing outside the courtroom with her briefcase and a calm expression that came from years of doing this. She asked if I was ready. I said yes. Good, she said, because Vivian brought half the neighborhood with her. Inside the gallery was nearly full. I recognized faces. Howard sat in the back row looking uncomfortable. A couple from 3 streets over who'd sent me that text about the dock. Chase Bennett and Linda Rasco, the other board members. Sitting beside Vivian in the front row. Vivian herself wore a navy suit and the kind of composed expression people use when they're confident they're right. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Patricia Wells entered, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every property dispute variation at least twice. She sat, reviewed the file in front of her, and asked both parties to present their cases. Claudia stood first. She introduced herself, introduced me, and laid out the facts with precision that made complicated things sound simple. In 1947, she began, Walter Grayson purchased 15 acres of land, including 412 meters of lakefront. The sale was registered with the county. A federal survey was conducted. Physical boundary markers were placed. For 77 years, that parcel remained legally registered under the same identification number. Mr. Grayson paid property taxes on it. He maintained it. He documented his ownership. When he passed away, the property transferred to his grandson through a valid will. The boundaries never changed. The registration never elapsed. She placed the deed on the evidence table, then the survey map, then printed photographs of each boundary marker, each one showing the parcel number carved into concrete. Then the GPS survey report showing exact coordinates. Finally, she placed the overlay comparison showing the HOS assumed boundary versus the legal boundary. She pointed to the 3-meter difference. That difference includes every community access point, every planned structure, and the dock currently under construction. The HOA has been operating under an assumption. My client is operating under the law. She sat down. The HOA's attorney stood. His name was Richard Vaughn. His strategy became clear within the first 2 minutes. He didn't dispute the deed. He didn't dispute the survey. Instead, he argued that the HOA's 24 years of open, continuous, and uncontested use of the lakefront constituted adverse possession. He cited state law. He cited precedent cases. He said the HOA had maintained the lakefront, paid for improvements, and treated it as community property since 2000. No one had objected. Not until now, when construction had already begun. He called it unfair to suddenly enforce a boundary that had been functionally ignored for decades. Claudia stood for rebuttal. She pulled out copies of the letters from Walter's files. The 2005 letter where Walter explicitly told the HOA the lakefront was private property. The 2012 letters where he refused to allow a survey. The 2014 letters where he wrote no across the HOA's request for access. She handed them to the judge. Walter objected repeatedly, she said, in writing. The moment my client became aware of the encroachment, he objected too. There was no period of uncontested use. There was only a period where the HOA chose to ignore objections. That's not adverse possession. That's trespass. Judge Wells reviewed the letters carefully. She asked Vaughn if the HOA had copies of these objections in their records. He hesitated. The current board took over in 2018, he said. They may not have been aware of correspondence from earlier years. The judge asked if that changed the legal validity of the objections. He admitted it did. Not. She asked if he had any documentation showing Walter had given permission for the HOA to use the lakefront. He said no. The lack of enforcement suggested tacit approval. Claudia interjected. Lack of enforcement isn't the same as permission. Choosing not to sue isn't the same as granting rights. The judge nodded. I've heard enough, she said. She took 5 minutes to review the documents again. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of pages turning. Then she looked up. The law here is clear, she said. The deed is valid. The survey is valid. The boundary markers confirm the coordinates. The county records confirm continuous registration. The letters confirm that the owner objected to HOA use. Adverse possession does not apply. She ruled that parcel CL 470089 belonged to me, that the boundaries established in 1947 remained legally binding, and that any structures built within those boundaries without permission constituted trespass. She made the temporary restraining order permanent. The HOA was ordered to cease all construction immediately, remove any structures built within the boundary, and remove the members-only sign within 14 days. The room was silent. Then Vivian stood, her face pale. She walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. Chase and Linda followed. Vaughn gathered his papers and left. Outside the courthouse, Claudia said this was a clean win. The HOA would have to comply or face contempt charges. I stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the parking lot. A few people were still talking in small groups. I saw Vivian sitting in her car, staring straight ahead. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. This had never been about winning. It had been about making sure the truth didn't get erased just because it was inconvenient. I drove back to the lake house. The members-only sign was still on my dock, but now it felt different. Temporary. A mistake about to be corrected. Inside, I sat at Walter's desk. I thought about what came next. The HOA would remove their structures. They'd take down the sign. But that wasn't the end. That was just a correction. A week later, the county clerk mailed a single page confirming what the judge had already said. The land was legally, permanently mine. The same day, the county sent a separate notice to the HOA. I didn't see it, but Howard told me about it later over coffee at my kitchen table. It outlined the violations. Construction without property owner permission. Placement of signage on private land. Misrepresentation of property boundaries in official HOA documents. The fine was $15,000 payable within 30 days. Additionally, the county building inspector had red-tagged the community dock project, which meant all work had to stop immediately, and any completed portions had to be removed unless the property owner granted written permission. Howard said the notice had been delivered to Vivian's address and copied to the entire HOA board. By that evening, it was the only thing anyone in the neighborhood was talking about. Thursday morning, I received an email from Chase Bennett. He was one of the board members, the quieter one who rarely spoke at meetings. The email was short. The board had held an emergency session the night before. Vivian had resigned as president effective immediately. She'd also resigned from the board entirely. Chase and Linda were now acting as interim leadership until a special election could be held. He apologized for the boundary dispute, said the board had relied on information that turned out to be incorrect. Asked if I'd be willing to meet to discuss next steps. The tone was different from anything I'd received from the HOA before. No assumptions, no demands, just a question. I replied and said I'd meet with them Saturday morning at my house. Saturday came. Chase and Linda arrived at 9 a.m., both looking tired and slightly uncomfortable. I invited them in, and we sat at the kitchen table. Chase started by apologizing again. He said the board had operated under Vivian's leadership for 8 years and had trusted her research on property boundaries. They'd never thought to verify it independently. When I brought my survey report, they'd assumed it was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up. Now, they understood it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a mistake. A big one. They wanted to fix it. Linda asked what I wanted. Not in a defensive way. In a genuine way. I told them I wanted the sign removed from my dock. I wanted acknowledgement that the lakefront was private property. And I wanted to make sure this kind of thing didn't happen again to me or anyone else. Chase said the sign would be gone by Monday. He'd remove it himself. As for acknowledgement, the board was already drafting a letter to all residents explaining the situation and correcting the record. They'd include a copy of the court ruling and an apology for the confusion. Linda said they'd also revise the HOA's governing documents to require independent verification of all property claims before taking any action. No more assumptions. Then Chase asked about the dock. The community dock project had been a major initiative. They'd raised funds, held meetings, gotten resident buy-in. The pilings were already poured. The materials were already purchased. If I forced them to remove everything, it would cost the HOA over $30,000 and leave the community with nothing. He wasn't asking me to donate the land. He was asking if I'd consider leasing it. They'd pay a fair rate. They'd sign a formal contract. They'd acknowledge my ownership in writing. In exchange, the community would have the dock they'd planned. I asked what they considered a fair rate. Linda said they budgeted $500 per year for maintenance and insurance. They could pay me that amount as a lease fee. I thought about it. $500 wasn't much, but that wasn't really the point. The point was whether I wanted to be the person who said no just because I could. Walter had fought to protect his property, but he'd also lived here peacefully for decades. He'd never locked people out. He just wanted them to ask first, to respect the boundaries. I told Chase and Linda I'd agree to a lease, but with conditions. The lease would be for 5 years, renewable if both parties agreed. The HOA would maintain liability insurance that named me as an additional insured. They'd be responsible for all maintenance and repairs. And most importantly, the lease would include a clause stating that the lakefront remained private property and that access was granted by permission, not by right. If they violated the terms, the lease would terminate immediately. Chase and Linda looked at each other, then nodded. Linda said those terms were fair. More than fair. They'd have their attorney draft the agreement and send it to Claudia for review. If everything looked good, they'd sign within 2 weeks. We shook hands. They left, and for the first time since I'd found that sign on my dock, I felt like the situation was moving towards something sustainable. Not perfect, not erased, but acknowledged and accounted for. Monday morning, Chase arrived with a tool set and a screwdriver. I watched from the porch as he removed the sign, unscrewing each bolt carefully and pulling it free from the wooden post. He carried it back to his truck and drove away. The post looked bare without it. Just old, weathered wood with 4 holes where the bolts had been. I walked down later that day and ran my hand over the surface. The wood was rough, sun-bleached, exactly as it had been before any of this started. 2 weeks later, Claudia called. She'd reviewed the lease agreement. It was solid. Clear terms, fair obligations, no loopholes. She recommended I sign it. I did. The HOA resumed construction on the community dock. This time, with a permit that listed me as the property owner and them as authorized lessees. The project finished in 6 weeks. When it was done, it looked good. Professional. Well-built. I didn't use it much, but I'd see families there on weekends. Kids fishing off the edge. Adults sitting in lawn chairs. And that felt right. The lake was big enough for all of us, as long as everyone understood whose land they were standing on. 3 months after the lease was signed, I went to see Marcus. We sat on his back porch, the lake visible through the trees. And I told him I'd been thinking about what came next. The dock lease was working. The boundaries were clear, but there was still a gap between what the community wanted and what the law allowed. I asked if he'd ever heard of a land trust. He hadn't, I explained. A land trust is a non-profit organization that holds or manages land for a specific purpose: conservation, public access, historic preservation. I was thinking about a trust focused on lakefront stewardship. I'd donate a conservation easement covering 60% of my lakefront property. That easement would guarantee public access to specific areas while protecting the land from overdevelopment. The trust would be governed by a board elected by neighborhood residents, rotating members every 2 years to prevent concentrated power. I'd serve as an advisory member, but wouldn't hold decision-making authority. The goal was to create a system that outlasted any individual, including me. Chase asked what I'd get out of it. I said clarity. Right now, every decision about the lakefront ran through me. With a trust, there'd be a formal process, transparent, accountable. And it would protect the land long-term. Even after I was gone, I'd retain 40% of the lakefront for private use, including my dock. That was non-negotiable, but the rest would be formalized under the trust's management. A week later, the HOA held a special meeting at the community center. About 40 people showed up. I stood at the front with a printed presentation, maps showing the proposed easement area, and a draft of the trust charter. I walked them through it step by step. Some people asked questions. Someone asked if this meant I was giving up ownership. I said no, I'd still own the land. The easement just restricted what I could do with it. I couldn't develop it, couldn't sell it for subdivision, couldn't revoke access arbitrarily. Someone else asked what would stop the trust from becoming another HOA, another power structure prone to the same problems. I said the charter included term limits, open elections, and a requirement that all meetings be public with minutes posted online within 48 hours. Transparency wasn't optional. It was built into the structure. Howard raised his hand and asked why I was doing this. I told him the truth, because I realized Walter hadn't just left me land. He'd left me a method. Precision builds justice, and justice, when done right, builds community. The vote to support the trust formation passed with 36 in favor, 2 against, and 2 abstentions. It wasn't unanimous, but it was strong enough to move forward. Over the next 2 months, I worked with an attorney who specialized in conservation law. We drafted the easement. We filed it with the county. We established the Clear Lake Community Trust as a registered nonprofit. The first board election was held in early September. 7 seats, 14 candidates. The vote was conducted by secret ballot with an independent third party counting the results. Marcus won a seat. Howard won a seat. 5 others I knew by face, if not by name. In October, the trust organized its first public event, a lakefront cleanup day. More than 50 people showed up, including families with kids. We cleared brush, picked up litter, and repaired eroded banks. At the end of the day, someone set up a grill. We ate burgers and sat on the grass near the water. I talked with people I'd barely spoken to before. Neighbors who'd been suspicious of me during the legal fight, but now understood what I'd been trying to do. Not take something away. Make sure it can't be taken. Howard sat down next to me as the sun started to set. He said Walter would have liked this. The trust, the cleanup, the way people were taking responsibility instead of just assuming someone else would handle it. I said I hoped so. Howard said he knew so because Walter had spent his whole life protecting this place quietly, and now it was being protected loudly out in the open with everyone watching. That was the difference. I looked out at the lake and realized Howard was right. The boundaries were still there. The property was still mine. But it wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to a system, a process, A community that finally understood the difference between using something and owning it. 1 year later, I stood in the basement archive room and looked at the map on the wall. The same map Walter had hung there decades ago. The red boundary lines still traced the parcel exactly as they had in 1947, but now there was something else. A transparent overlay showing the conservation easement in blue, the areas managed by the Clear Lake Community Trust. The two maps together told the full story. What was protected by law? What was shared by choice? I'd open the room to public tours once a month. Neighbors could come see the original survey, read Walter's journal, understand how property boundaries worked and why they mattered. Most months, only 3 or 4 people showed up. But the ones who came asked good questions. Vivian Carr had moved away 6 months after the court ruling. Howard told me about it one evening when he stopped by to drop off some tomatoes from his garden. She'd put the house on the market quietly. No open houses. A young couple from the city bought it within 3 weeks. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. Just left. I didn't think about her much. Not with anger, not with satisfaction. She'd made a mistake. A big one. Built a system of authority on assumptions instead of verification. But she wasn't evil. She was just wrong. And the system had corrected it. That was the point of having laws and courts and records. No one person's error, no matter how confident or powerful they seemed, could permanently rewrite reality. In May, on the anniversary of the day I'd first seen that members-only sign, I went down to my dock with a cup of coffee and sat at the end. The morning was cool and quiet. The water was still as glass. I thought about everything that had happened in the past year. The discovery in the basement, the maps and markers, the surveys and court hearing, the lease negotiation, the trust formation. Each step had felt overwhelming at the time, like I was building something without a blueprint. But looking back, it formed a clear path. A logical progression from confusion to clarity, from conflict to resolution, from individual ownership to collective stewardship. I hadn't set out to change the community. I just wanted to protect what was mine. But in protecting it the right way, by proving rather than demanding, by building systems rather than asserting power, I'd created something larger than ownership. I'd created accountability. A family walked by on the path near the shore, the one the trust had widened and mulched last month. 2 parents, a kid maybe 7 years old, wearing a bright yellow life vest. The kid saw me sitting on the dock and waved with both hands. I waved back. They kept walking toward the community dock. The kid chattering about wanting to catch a fish. Simple, normal, unremarkable. That was the real victory. Not the court ruling, not the trust documents, not even the fact that my name was on the deed. The real victory was that people could use this space, know the rules, respect them, and move through their day without drama or resentment or confusion about who had the right to be there. The boundaries were clear. The access was defined. And within that clarity, people were just living. I finished my coffee and stood up, feeling the dock sway slightly under my weight. Back at the house, I sat at Walter's desk. I pulled out a piece of cream-colored paper of the kind he'd always used for important things and uncapped a pen. I'd been thinking about writing something down. A letter like the one he'd left me. Not for a crisis. Not a warning, just context. A record for whoever inherited this place next. I wrote, "If you're reading this, I'm gone. The lake is still here. So are the boundaries. The deed is in the archive. Room along with the original 1947 survey and all the documentation that proved ownership when it was challenged. Don't let anyone tell you the boundaries don't matter. They do. They're the foundation of everything else. But don't let the boundaries make you a stranger to your neighbors either. There's a balance between protecting what's yours and sharing what you can. Find it. And when someone inevitably tries to take what's yours, because someone always will eventually, don't get angry. Don't get loud. Get precise. Evidence, coordinates, documents, witnesses, professional surveys if you need them. Precision builds justice, and justice, when done right, builds community. I folded the letter, placed it in the wooden box with the brass clasp, and set it back on the shelf in the archive room. The lake was still here. The boundaries were still here. And now, they were documented in a way that no one could ignore. Walter had understood something that most people never learn. The truth doesn't disappear just because people stop looking for it. It just waits, quietly, patiently, and sometimes, when you're finally ready to listen, it tells you exactly what you need to know. END